public session. And just to advise members that you're welcome to use the mobile devices as long as they are in airplane mode, and all devices are muted. This includes the members' tablet devices, and they connect to this end of Wi-Fi. Also to remind members that we are obliged to declare any financial or relevant interests which might reasonably be thought by others to influence our approach to the matter under consideration. Any member who has an interest to declare in relation to today's business should do so now, or when a particular matter arises during our deliberations.
Comes to budget issues then, just suppose previously I'm a non-practising member of the bar.
Okay, thank you.
Well, it means I don't get any money, so obviously I don't have financial interest.
Just to advise members also that due to the length of the recent plenary sittings, the additional sittings, the oral evidence session with the Minister on the draft budget will not be recorded by Hansard. Agenda item 1, apologies. We have an apology from Robin Newton, and Doug is joining us by Starleaf, as is Rachel. Gemma is here along with Peter in person, and we haven't. And the Deputy Chair said that she would be late, and we haven't heard from any of the other committee members. Again, just in relation to Standing Order 1156, if there is there's no delegation of votes, so that will not be necessary. Agenda item 2 is consideration of the draft budget, the oral evidence session with the Minister of Justice and her officials. And can I welcome the Minister and the Deputy, not the Deputy, Permanent Secretary. You got demoted there, Peter. You're very welcome to the committee. And obviously this follows, Minister, on from last week's oral evidence session with the Chief Constable and his colleagues, the PSNI, and they have provided information on the way that the service is funded to highlight the dependence on the non-recurrent and unsustainable funding and the relevant correspondence. And members, you'll find that in your pack for this morning. So, Minister, you're very welcome. Thank you for taking the time. And I want to say, on a personal basis and as Chair, you have been very accommodating with your time, both you and your officials, on this issue and others. We have a long day ahead of us. Hopefully it'll not be as long as maybe everybody's predicting, but we want to try and get through this. I think one of the issues that did arise was, is the 2% a cut, or is it not as bad as what maybe a lot of the organisations were saying? I think that was the basic thrust of what was being said by at least one or a number of members of the committee, and on the basis of that, the committee asked if we could have this conversation. So,
okay. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the committee about this. As you've noted, Peter May is here as my Permanent Secretary, but also Mary-Ann Smith, who is our Deputy Director of Financial Services. So hopefully any complicated questions I will be able to pass to one or other of them for an answer. Obviously, in terms of the draft budget outcome, I want to thank you in engaging with me and my officials and the stakeholders in as fulsome a way as the committee has. I hope that it's been helpful in terms of getting a rounded picture of the kind of damage that the current draft budget proposals would have on the Justice family if it were to become a reality. As you're aware, I've been very clear from the outset that I can't support the draft budget given the damage it would cause the justice system. But that message is now coming through, not just from me as Justice Minister, but actually from many of the members of the Justice family. In developing the draft budget proposals, the underlying assumption was departments would be able to find the proposed 2% reduction required to provide additional funding to health from efficiencies. However, this is simply not achievable, so I think this speaks to your particular question that your members may have had. It's simply not achievable in the justice budget without significant impact to frontline services, whether that be police, prisons, courts, legal services. Indeed, the Chief Constable, as you're aware, has felt it necessary to freeze recruitment in this financial year due to the uncertainty of adequate funding for that in future years. The draft proposals would have a direct impact on vulnerable groups and victims, with further implications from failure to deliver against statutory responsibilities and increased downstream costs for the justice system, the health service itself and the wider public sector. Consequences will also severely impact on public confidence and would have a detrimental impact on frontline services which contribute to public safety and preservation of life. The draft budget for 2022 to 2025 is in stark contrast, Mr Chairman, with the recognition in England of the need to invest in justice services, with £2 billion allocated in the recent budget by Rishi Sunak. That was not transferred or hypothecated in any way, as is normal within the executive, but we saw no benefit from that allocation at all in Justice here, despite facing the same challenges. Department of Justice already relies heavily on in-year monitoring, having received additional funding of 27.9 million, which is about 2.6% of our baseline during 2021-22. I think that demonstrates the challenges faced if we try to live within an allocation before a 2% cut is applied. The scope to achieve further reductions whilst delivering the full range of services has now been eroded by years of austerity. So before taking account of the impact of inflation, the Department's resource baseline in 2021-2022 is already 9% lower than in 2011 to 2012. The Department is facing essential pressures across all business areas, which, when coupled with inflationary costs, increased energy costs, national insurance contributions uplift and so on, are significant. The increase in cost due to the changes in national insurance contributions is estimated to be between 5.9 and 6.5 million per annum over the 3-year budget. In addition, the current draft budget proposals don't include any specific funding for COVID recovery. Without that recovery funding, backlogs will continue. Based on the current modelling, for example, backlogs will continue to be on 2027 in the Crown Court, with unacceptable impacts on both victims and witnesses. Without extra funding, the Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunal Service couldn't comply with public health guidance for staff and court users, bringing unacceptable risks. Therefore, further cuts would have to be made to the Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunal Service business as usual operations. Based on management information at the 1st of January 2022, there were approximately 11,900 defendants in the court system compared to approximately 7,300 at March 2020. So that's about 63% more. And those figures are just based on the number of defendants, not the number of cases. Justice has also taken on additional work since 2011-2012 and absorbed this from within the reduced baseline. For example, significant new costs resulting from legislation, for example in relation to domestic abuse, and also the increased demand from statutory responsibilities such as support for victims of human trafficking and modern slavery. You'll be aware the Department has tried to take steps to tackle the underlying causes of crime through greater focus on rehabilitation and problem-solving justice, for example, substance misuse courts. Those interventions, however, require significant investment, though they have a big payback if they're successful. This draft budget will mean that those initiatives are under threat, and that will increase both the number of future victims and contribute to future pressure on health, housing and other key public services. DOJ seems to be, in many ways, Mr Chairman, a victim of its own success. Having delivered efficiencies such as the implementation of the Owners Review in the prison service, the ORS review, in the prison service, which, despite an increase in the prison population of over 7% from 2010 to 2022, staffing levels and costs, together with operational costs, have actually decreased, bringing the cost per prisoner placed down from 73.8 thousand to 45,000, a decrease of 39%. Further example is that since the devolution of justice, Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunal Service has faced significant budget reductions. Numerous steps have been taken to absorb these cuts, manage in-year pressures and absorb additional work. This has included, for example, a reduction in staff complement of 16%, a reduction in leased accommodation by relocating 135 staff and the closure of 2 hearing centres. In recent years, the Courts and Tribunal Service has also absorbed additional work and resulting pressures, for example, the deprivation of Liberty Tribunal, which was 1.1 million in 2021-22, the Planning Appeals Commission and Water Appeals Commission, local development plans, which was around just over $500,000 in 21-22, and has launched an ambitious modernisation programme. To date, Northern Ireland Courts and Tribunal Service have been able to manage these pressures in year, primarily due to a high number of vacancies, but it isn't a sustainable position. The draft budget in 2022-25 includes 14.8 million per annum to PSNI for police staffing. This allocation can only be used for that specific purpose, which is insufficient to maintain police officer numbers at approximately 7,100. Also, further progress towards achieving the new decade-and-year approach commitment of 7,500 officers will not be possible unless further funding is made available. In fact, with an allocation of only 14.8 million, this would reverse the uplift in headcount underway in 2021-22. Furthermore, the department could not achieve 2% cuts without impacting the PSNI budget, as the PSNI budget is around 67% of the total departmental budget, excluding security funding. So it is a fairly difficult position that we find ourselves in, but those examples, I think, give a flavour of the efficiency and effectiveness of budget management across the justice family and demonstrate that there is little to no scope in terms of meeting our pressures and delivering a 2% cut without stopping or pausing frontline services and recruitment. Indeed, although there is a vacancy level of some 16% across the department, the current draft budget proposals mean that the department could simply not afford to fill those vacancies, putting further pressure on the workforce. And it's for those reasons that I wouldn't be in a position to agree the draft budget unless we saw significant changes. It may be that since the draft budget was drawn up, that there is more flexibility at the centre than had been anticipated. And we continue to engage with the Department of Finance to try to find a constructive way forward in the hope that that would be able to be allocated, at least some of that flexibility to justice, to allow us to continue the work that we do in the department. But you'll appreciate, given what I have said today, and also I think given what partners in the justice system have said, that it is a fairly bleak picture.
Thank you, Minister, for that. And obviously, one of the issues that keeps reoccurring here, excuse the pun, is the fact that, and if you talk to the issue in relation to the police, their situation seems to be that they have known recurrent funding for a fair number of officers. So if they were to bring it right back to what they have in their baseline to fund officers, they reckon it's about 6.4. Anything additional that has brought us up to almost a 7.1 has been solely on the basis of monies that they've either got for additional security money and your monitoring. So it's recurrent and it's never consolidated in the baseline. What discussions, and I know I've only sort of picked on one element, the police element, for the simple reason that, as you rightly said, it makes up 68% of your budget of the allocation that's given. So has there been, over a period of time, any discussions around how even what they have as non-recurrent actually is consolidated into the baseline to help them to be in a far better place, rather than going the way they do every year, which is just keep bidding and hoping. And as I always say, there's three in this marriage, because you have the NIO, and there is going into the dark side when it comes to trying to understand, how we get additional money, and that can create its own challenges.
Well, there has been some discussion, I know, with colleagues in the Department of Finance about particularly end-of-year flexibility for the PSNI, because that's an issue. In terms of security funding, that obviously comes from the NIO, and I don't believe should be part of the DOJ baseline, because it's something that is given directly to the PSNI and it fluctuates. It's not part of our allocation. And I suppose that's the question you asked first, is it a cut or is it an efficiency? Well, actually, it is a reduction in our baseline. If you take security funding out, because I don't believe it belongs there, and also if you remove the allocation, for example, for things like domestic abuse, which is, from our perspective, not solely for justice, it's for a cross-cutting piece of work. When you take that out, we actually see a reduction on our baseline in the first year of minus 0.1%. So we are seeing an actual reduction in terms of our baseline. But maybe if I could hand over to Marianne or to Peter, just in relation to how the police funding specifically has been dealt with by the Department of Finance and within our own allocation.
So if I just say something, perhaps, Chair, there are three different sources of funding that are not fully baseline. So we start with the EU funding. That was for 300 officers. It was agreed in 2019, as I recall. And a significant proportion of that is now within the PSNI baseline, because over various years we've got additional funding from the Department of Finance, but there is a gap of around just under 6.5 million at the moment still in terms of a shortfall there. And we would absolutely aspire to getting that into the baseline. The situation with the additional security funding and the paramilitary crime task force is slightly different because, as the Minister has noted, those are both part funded by the Treasury and by the Department of Finance. So there's a combination of funding. And because we don't have certainty of funding for the future from the Treasury, you can't baseline that money, certainly not the Treasury part of that money. What we do know now is that we do know what is being provided for additional security funding for the next 3 years, and we also know what's being provided for the paramilitary crime task force for the next 3 years. So for this budget period, we do have a planning assumption. The PS&I have highlighted that there is a gap for them in terms of the amount they've got for that additional security funding over what they believe they need, of around £7.5 million. Those are the different component parts. And some of them can be baselined, others would require the Treasury to make a decision to give us money forever rather than on a temporary basis.
Okay, thank you. Mary-Ann, do you want to add anything to that? No, thank you. Okay. Peter?
Yep, thank you, Minister. I suppose 4 points. I think I would say as well, maybe we find ourselves in a position where we're very much on the same page as yourself. I don't know whether that should worry you or worry me, or both of us kind of thing on that basis.
Probably both of us a little bit.
I know. I'll make a promise. I'll not put it down on my election literature if you keep it off yours. I suppose able to take each of these in turn, just in terms of the first three are more generic and the fourth is a little bit more specific. I assume internally, I appreciate we're not at the final position in terms of the final budget, but given the scale of the impact on justice, I presume that you're not in a position to turn around and say, here are particular aspects of justice family, we are going to ring fence or protect particular aspects of it, because that would mean simply the cuts should be even deeper elsewhere. I presume there's been no decisions or final positions taken in terms of saying, for instance, yes, we're going to protect youth justice, for instance, but that would mean that we're going to have to cut more in terms of the policing side of things on it, because presumably at most you would have just a little bit of tinkering over the percentages.
I think the difficulty with trying to ring fence anything and protect it, well, first of all, in terms of policing, it's just too big a part of the budget for us to be able to do anything in that. And similarly, I think with some of the other kind of areas that are particularly heavily reliant on personnel, so things like prisons and so on, it would be very difficult to see how you could ring fence their funding and not have an even deeper impact elsewhere. There just isn't that flexibility. But I think the other thing to consider is that many of the things that we do are demand-led or statutory duties. So our ability to flex and say, well, we'll protect this and not protect that is quite limited. We also, in this budget, have a lot less, if you like, general funds than most other departments would have in order to set our own priorities, because so much of our money, even in this budget, is ring-fenced, either to go to the PSNI, to go to new recruitment, to go to dealing with domestic abuse. So much of the budget is actually ring-fenced that there's actually very little flex for us. So I think that compounds the issue. In terms of engaging with some of our other justice partners, I mean, we have been engaging on the basis that we'll all have to absorb around the same amount on this. I don't think it's something where, we don't have enough scope at the centre, for example, to protect other partners from the impact of this, but it will be significant. And it's also important to say that whilst we might have some priorities within the department, things that we don't want to not do, we need to be conscious that it's important for us to ensure that all of the different moving parts of the justice system are resourced at the correct level, that they're moving in synchronicity. What we can't have is a situation where you fund policing to a greater extent and then the courts can't cope with what the police are bringing before the courts, or you fund the courts and the prisons can't cope, or you fund the prisons and you end up with extra capacity and nobody actually being arrested. So there is a balance to be struck in terms of ensuring that all parts of the system are properly funded, and that also goes for those parts of the system over which we don't have direct control, but where we do provide funding. For example, things like Legal Services Agency when it comes to legal aid. I mean, that's quite an important part of the system, because if you don't have practitioners, you can't actually run the justice system. So we can't dictate to them what they do and don't do. But getting paid on time, and you'll have heard this from them directly, it is fairly crucial in terms of their cash flow, particularly for those smaller practitioner groups, or alternatively for sole practitioners in the case of barristers, where they simply wouldn't have the cash flow to be able to sustain a living if they're not being paid for almost a year after they've completed the work.
Second point, I suppose, and I appreciate these could probably be seen as slightly leading questions in relation to that. But I wonder if you want to comment on to what extent strategically does the draft budget create a level, particularly for justice and health, of a certain level of false economy. And what I mean by that is that to some extent, various departments, there's effectively a shift over towards health away from, and particularly I suppose where justice particularly hit. But in doing so, the implications when it comes to then what is delivered on the ground for justice actually, by cutting particular services in justice, actually stokes up what will be additional costs in terms of health, but also I think risks a scenario where almost a bit like sort of the childhood game of you're it type of thing, where there are different agencies who effectively then, be it within the sort of justice or health side of things or a range of other bodies, where effectively there will almost have to be an attempt by various bodies to almost pass on costs elsewhere and say, we're not taking responsibility for this. And there are certain things which then it run the risks of nobody wanting to take responsibility for, or not, maybe not wanting to, but not feeling they're in a position to because of the financial costs in relation to it. So just in terms of the knock-on effects also of while on the one hand saving, inverted commas, money to go over to health, but actually in storing up additional health costs.
Well, I mean, I think it's a very astute observation. There are two things I would say. First of all, there is the issue of not doing the early intervention and rehabilitation work, and that has an ongoing impact on wider society. So, for example, the work that we do, particularly within our prisons, largely through the community and voluntary sector in terms of delivering rehabilitation work, in terms of delivering for prisoners who may arrive with us with mental health and addiction issues and undergo support within the prisons to overcome those issues. Also, it would be fair to say that in things like, for example, if you look at the model that we have adopted for the kind of mental health and the substance misuse courts, a lot of the support, the therapeutic support that is provided as part of that model, we provide through third sector partners, and we fund in the Department of Justice. Now, if you look to Scotland, for example, it's the Department of Health in Scotland that actually provide those services alongside the Department of Justice. So you have the court and you have the health business right beside it. So the two work in parallel. Now, we've been able to do that, and we have done that in recognition of the pressure that health is under. But we would not have the scope to do things that, if you like, are beyond our strict responsibilities given this budget, which would simply mean us then having to get into a negotiation with the Department of Health to replace services that we would no longer be able to fund, particularly, I think, from community and voluntary sector organisations at this stage. And we would be seeking then to ask Health to fund those directly. Now, I'm not sure. It feels a little bit to me like a pointless exercise when there's already an established method. But there are other areas where we have been trying to work with health more closely. So you'll be aware of things like the multi-agency triage teams within policing and so on. And there's been some real pushback in terms of the affordability of that from a health perspective. But obviously, if you're sitting as a police officer trying to, work out the multi-agency triage teams, you're taking a 2% reduction in funding in the PSNI, but health are getting a 10% increase. The balance of funding in that is bound then to have to shift. But the question is whether or not it will be seen as a priority. It's absolutely a priority for us in justice because we see the benefits of it in terms of the justice system and the outworkings of that. But whether it will be seen as a priority in health is another matter. So it's not even simply that there would be more demands moved to health. That would probably be true. But they won't all be met because they will not necessarily align with the health priorities, though they may align with justice priorities. And so I think that there will have to be some realignment. Now, I think the crossover between health and justice is one of the most obvious crossover points. But there are also crossovers, for example, with health or with justice and communities in terms of housing, and particular supported accommodation, bail accommodation, all of those things. Those are things where I'm engaging with the Communities Minister around looking at some of those challenges. But again, if we are both facing significant strains on our budgets, it's hard to see how we can then flex to address those issues in terms of being able to deliver better outcomes. And it is undoubtedly the case. I mean, we know the things that make a difference to people. You know, we know that people are less likely to offend if they have a job, they're less likely to offend if they have employment, they're less likely to offend if they have stable family relationships, they're less likely to offend if they have good mental health and aren't suffering with substance abuse issues. So we know all of those things, but trying to deliver them as a package can be quite complicated. And so most of the people that we engage with in the justice system have at some point earlier been failed, whether it be by education, health, housing, whatever it might be. But being able to kind of put people back together again is quite an intensive process. So I think there will be some challenges around justice. I think particularly in that space where up until now we have carried some of the burden that isn't our responsibility, but we've been willing to do it because we recognise pressures in health. We just won't have the capacity to do that, and it's questionable whether health will be willing or able to step into that space.
The third point, and there's a certain level of overlap with some of the previous comments, but also I suppose some of the stuff you touched on. I want to just touch on then the impact on innovation and investment, because where there are significant budget cuts, it acts probably as two levels of barriers to innovation. First of all, from a pragmatic point of view and a psychological point of view, any department, whether it's justice or another department, will quite often look at it and say, we've got to make this already sort of fairly substantial cuts. If we are then to put in an extra 5 million, 10 million, 15 million, whatever it happens to be, into a range of innovative new ideas, there's a barrier to that, because both from a practical point of view, but also then there's a reluctance from departments to then say, well, we've already gone to the police or prison service or whatever and asked them to make such and such level of cuts. It's very difficult then to turn around and say, well, we need to get a few more extra million out of this to help fund that. That in and of itself then tends to be a tendency for departments then to forego anything innovative, because it makes some of the rest a lot more painful. But also, I suppose, related to that is a concern, as you've highlighted, that so much of the justice family and on what has to be delivered is a legal statutory requirement, that then the tendency is also to cut programmes which will have an invest to save quality to them, because they may not necessarily be, you know, they're something which is very virtuous and everybody sees that, but they may not be something that is statutorily required to be done. But obviously the problem with that is you may, in a particular intervention, save, you know, £100,000 which could go in the particular intervention, but actually it will mean that 3 years down the line it's costing extra £500,000 to the justice system on that basis. So maybe if you just want to comment on that aspect of it.
Well, I mean, I'll maybe ask Peter also to comment on this, but I mean, one of the areas I suppose that justice has been quite good is around innovation, and we've had a number of pilot schemes and kind of new developments in terms of justice, in terms of trying to tackle the reasons and the causes of offending, as well as dealing with the consequences of offending. So we know, for example, I mean, just as an example, we know that people who have gone through the justice system as victims, that their healing process, if you like, only really starts when the court case ends. So, I mean, we've engaged with Professor Siobhan O'Neill, and she has spoken about the impact that has. And those people, if they're dealt with well in the justice system, if we invest in victim support, if we invest in kind of good wraparound care for them, are much less likely to go on to need intensive mental health support from the health department when they exit the justice system, because that's the point where they kind of leave us and they move on. So if we do our job well, and if we can invest in those things, it makes the burden on the health service less. So that's one example. There are other things like, as I say, the problem-solving justice arena, where we know that if we can engage with people at the very earliest stage and tackle the underlying causes of their offending behaviour, particularly if that's substance abuse, but it may lead to acquisitive crime and other things. If we can address the fundamental issue, whether that be mental health or substance abuse or whatever it might be, that we can have an impact on reoffending rates. But our ability to innovate in that way will definitely be constrained because they're not inexpensive interventions. So it isn't that they are cheap, but it is that they are cheaper in the long run than the alternative. In the same way that non-custodial sentences are cheaper than custodial sentences, but they're not easier to manage. They take resource. So you need good investment in probation. You need to have the right people there. You need to have people with social work qualifications. And frankly, those are like hen's teeth at the minute. And we're competing with health and with the courts and with probation and everybody else to try and get social workers because there just aren't enough. So there are real challenges, I think, that some of the innovation could be lost. And I suppose it's a bit like the situation that health finds itself in, where the immediacy of the problems are so enormous that the only focus is on those immediate problems and not on reform of the system. So you become obsessed with the backlogs. You become obsessed, right, and understandably when the waiting lists are so long. But we could find ourselves in a very similar dynamic where the length of time it takes from a suspect being identified and going through the system, through the courts, maybe sitting in remand for long periods of time, and it is not inexpensive to keep somebody in remand either. But we could end up in a situation where not only is there an injustice being done, which is a fundamental problem, but actually that the overall cost to the system is greater, but that we don't have the capacity to go back upstream and deal with the reform that's needed to speed up justice. I mean, that's been part of the balance that we will always have to make as a department. It can never be 100% tackle and delay. There has to be reform done upstream to make that possible. So things like the Committal Reform Bill have already set out some of the ways we can do that. But I suppose my concern is that, as with anything, it's like turning a tanker. You've got to be able to have a little bit to deal with the front end and the stuff that people are actually experiencing at that time. But you've also got to have enough power in the wheelhouse to be able to actually make the changes that are needed if you're going to get to where you need to be. And that's the concern that I have, is that what we end up doing is essentially a kind of firefighting exercise where we are trying to limit our exposure on those fronts where we are short of cash, rather than actually looking strategically and saying, how do we improve the overall impact of the justice system? And it isn't without its challenges, but we were making some headroom. I mean, people will have forgotten a long time ago, back in March 2020, we were actually seeing a reduction in the time taken for cases to go through court. Now, that has been upended by COVID, but the last thing I want to be doing is hearing a Justice Minister in 2027 talking about backlogs that relate to COVID in 2020. I mean, that's just not feasible. It's not fair. It isn't just, and it will deplete, I think, public confidence in the system. But maybe if I hand over to Peter, because I mean, there are some innovative things that we would like to do as a department, but they will be limited by funding.
So I think you've described it very well, Minister. Just perhaps to add two points. The first is that inevitably you have to look at core services first. So under this draft budget, core services would be significantly adversely impacted. And I think your point was, if you had a few pounds then that came available, would you put that into innovation? I think initially the first answer would have to be you'd have to shore up those core services. That would have to be where you put your first bit of money. The second thing is about the way the organisation orients itself. So, I'm proud to be part of a department that I think is really progressive, tries to be innovative, tries to look at the whole picture and to make a contribution, not just looking at it through narrow justice terms, but trying to look at it holistically. But the reality is now that people right through the organisation, as we go through our business planning process, they're looking at how they can make savings, how they can be innovative in terms of reducing their spend, but still delivering the best service they can. They aren't in the position where they can be looking at how they develop new and innovative proposals as to how we can do things. So, there's always some things, we continue to work on our future legislative programme, for example, but But the orientation of the organisation changes when you get a budget like this, and it has to be about making the best you can with what you've got rather than how you can make things better.
The final point, the fourth point, I suppose, by making a fourth point, I appreciate I'm deviating from my Presbyterian roots on that basis. We had, already declared an interest as a non-practising member of the bar, but we had the Bar Council and representatives of the solicitors' profession in with us last week on the issue of legal aid. And I think, to be fair, and certainly I would share this view, that nobody is suggesting this is something, a route which the department wants or you want. It's a route which you may be forced down. But obviously they raised concerns over the impact on legal aid on things such as access to justice, such as the impact in terms of gender impacts, rural impact, impacts over family law, for instance, in terms of funding. But it also highlighted that whenever there was a initial devolution of policing and justice, and particularly the legal aid fund, there was effectively an understanding at that stage that the level of legal aid would be brought down to about 80 million. This is already below that projected, but also the quid pro quo for levels of reduction in legal aid would be a sort of prompt payment scheme. And the concern has been raised that to be able to live within budget, that the route which would, I suppose, possibly have to be gone down by the department would be to have a lot more delayed payments, that the time frame for payments would move from, mention was made of 8 weeks to perhaps as long as 47 weeks on that basis. And I suppose just 2 points to think, would you accept it if that is the case, albeit not through your choice, that it's a route which has gone down which is a level of a breach of understanding of where the initial position was on legal aid? And secondly, by largely live within, from an accounting point of view, within budget, by way of levels of delay, because delays, if you're still paying the same amount, but delaying it so that it's pushed outside the budgetary period, ultimately it's not really saving public money, but it is actually enabling you within that 3-year period to live within budget. That again, that has implications as well in relation to that, but again, no one's suggesting this is a route which you want to go down, but if you want to react to some of the criticism which has been levelled from that end of it.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I have a lot of sympathy for the position that the Law Society and the Bar Council have set out. It is not our desire to have people waiting for up to 48 weeks for payment. I just don't think, personally, I don't think that's acceptable, particularly in a small business where people's cash flow can often be critical. So it's not that their income is insufficient or that their workload is insufficient, but just their cash flow makes it impossible for them to maintain their business. I think you could see a lot of smaller practices go out of business. That's most likely to impact on rural communities. It's something that I've raised with executive colleagues, because you'll have a lot of pardon me, small solicitors' businesses, perhaps just one solicitor, and a few members of staff in a lot of small towns, and it may be the only solicitor that anyone knows, maybe the only solicitor that somebody in a crisis would know to go to. And of course, people can call the Law Society, can get a list of names, can travel a distance and find another solicitor. But I think for many people, their first port of call will be somebody they know, and they'll often have done business. If you look at farming communities, you'll often have a solicitor's office that goes back generations in a family, and the same people will have done business for generations together, and there is a level of trust. So I think that will be to the detriment of access. I think there's also a very valid point in terms of the differential impact this could have on different parts of the profession. So, for example, barristers who tend to be sole practitioners could be particularly hard hit, but especially young people coming through who would fail to be able essentially to make money to survive and to pay the bills. And that's going to be more challenging for those. And we always talk about wanting people from less advantaged backgrounds to be able to enter the law. But if you can't have that family support, if your family can't pay your bills for you while you build your professional reputation, it's going to be even harder if your payments for the work you've done have been delayed. And so it prevents, I think, people from less well-off backgrounds being able to start in the profession.
I suppose, and similarly, that if you're coming in, someone's coming in without, not just, if you like, the family background, but potentially, say, the connections
of course,
that are there where they can pick up a certain amount of work
Absolutely, and I mean networking is key in so many professions, and it's often one of the biggest barriers to people, again, who come from outside, if you like, those networks, who maybe don't have family who previously practiced law, don't have any connections into the system, and don't have the opportunity to benefit from that. So I think it could make the law a more exclusive profession, which is the antithesis of what the Law Society and the Bar Council are trying to achieve. It could also have detrimental impact, I think, on women in law, because many of them will practice family law particularly, but also will be more reliant, therefore, on legal aid payments as a result of that. And that's often a choice that women make, because they go into the profession seeking to do that kind of work, to help families and to be involved in that work. But it could have a significant impact on their ability to continue with their work, and I think that's something that we need to be acutely aware of. So there are all sorts of implications of this in terms of access to justice. I think fundamentally the issue around the reform that has been undertaken, and I mean, the Department of Justice has undertaken major reform. I mean, we were certainly not lauded by the Bar Council or the legal profession more generally when we did major reform of the legal aid system in order to bring legal aid under some form of financial control, albeit that it is a demand-led system. We've tried to simplify. I suppose the quid pro quo for that is to simplify how the payments are made so that it's less bureaucratic, to try and deal with the challenges that we have in terms of meeting our budget. But you're correct in saying that the understanding was that if the legal profession worked with the department, that the result of it would be that legal aid payments, if you like, would be clearer, cleaner, more efficient and more timely. And that was the basis, I think, on which they were willing to cooperate, even where perhaps, if you like, the headline figures weren't something that they were delighted with, but the prospect of being paid on time kind of made it worthwhile, which I think just stresses how important kind of prompt payment is for small businesses. I don't want to see us go down a route where we are not paying promptly, because you're quite right, it doesn't change the amount of legal, I mean, legal aid is granted based on a means test, or it's granted by the courts. So the department doesn't have control over how many people are granted legal aid and aren't. So the cost of the public purse at the headline figure remains the same, but the in-year expenditure changes. But it simply means that we have a backlog of payments that need to be made. And my fear, as I said when I've spoken about this before, is that we will end up at the end of 3 years in a situation where if we are not paying people for the work they've done for up to 47 weeks, the backlog will be unrecoverable financially, because there will be so much money owing to the profession that we would never be in a position to have enough to pay the in-year allocation, that the money that is earned in that year, and eat into that backlog of payments. So we would reach a point at the end of 3 years where in perpetuity we would have a backlog of payments that would fluctuate up and down depending on our allocation each year, but would never be cleared. Now, I don't think that that's a good way to do business. We've spent a lot of time working with the audit office and others to make sure that our accounts are clear and everything is properly done to make our systems better and more robust. And I just think that heading into an unrecoverable situation with legal aid is difficult. I'd also have to be very honest and say that whilst the legal profession have been incredibly supportive of what we've been trying to do and have worked with us, there is a limit to how far people will be pushed. And it is not inconceivable that if people saw their payments being delayed to those sorts of extremes, that you could end up with the kind of industrial action that we saw before, where there was in effect a legal aid strike. Now, it took around 2 years to recover from that situation before. If you compound something like that on top of COVID recovery, you're into a pretty dire situation in terms of the operability of the justice system. So I am concerned, I have to say, about legal aid. And also fundamentally, we talk about legal aid as though it's a kind of standalone issue. It is part of our overall welfare package that we have for people. This is designed to ensure that those who cannot afford to pay for access to justice still have access to justice. It's one of the fundamental parts of the system, and often people get aggrieved because they see particular firms or particular companies or whatever seem to earn a lot of money from it. But it has to be borne in mind that they're earning that money as a result of representing people who cannot afford representation themselves. So they're going to solicitors who have a specialism in dealing with legal aid cases, but they're doing it because they need access to justice. So it's a crucial part of our welfare system. It's part of our contract with the public that even if you can't afford it, if you are wronged, you have a right to be able to access justice. And I think when you start to strip that right away, it's a very serious issue that goes way beyond just payments.
I think, yes, and I'll just make this as a comment rather than a question, so I'll pass on. I think one of the things that people don't always understand, which both in terms of the potential scale of the cuts across justice, but also in terms of there not being easy options, is the level of interdependence within the system, that even if you were to try to reduce the impact in one element of things because you're making cuts elsewhere, then as that we affect
There is one other thing. I'll maybe pass over to Peter because we have some additional reforms.
I was going to say, with respect, Minister, I'm conscious of maybe making that as a comment because I appreciate I've probably taken.
Sure.
Maybe just leave that hanging
there. There is a separate issue that I would maybe like to pass over to Peter, because there are some forthcoming reforms of legal aid that we're working with the legal profession on, and of course part of being able to do that is having a legal profession that are willing to cooperate and work with the department and trust us to do what we say we're going to do. So
no, I think you've made the point very well. The other reality is that over a 3-year budget, while for year one you really can't make any significant adjustments between budget lines because there isn't time for people to adjust, we would need to look at whether there are more radical steps that put in front of an incoming minister about how you spend the budget. And that could involve changes to the basis for legal aid as well as changes to a whole range of other things. I'm not in any sense predicting that that is where we would end up, but those are the sorts of things that we would need to look at over a 3-year period.
Okay. Gemma.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for coming here this morning. I know, as the Chair said, it's going to be a long, busy day, so we look forward to it. And sorry, I'm going to ask you to go over old ground again, so okay. I'm really going to torture you. But can you confirm that it's your assessment that DOJ is still facing a 2% cut across the board?
It's a 2% efficiency that we're being asked to find, Gemma. So what we actually have, if you want, is a cut on baseline. Let me just find the figure. But the cut on baseline, so you take out the security funding because that's not a part of our baseline. And if you remove the domestic and sexual abuse because that's a multi-departmental issue, what we end up with is a cut in the first year of 0.1%. We then have an increase of 0.7% and an increase of 0.1%. So there is an actual cut. Other departments have no actual cuts at all. So that's the contrast. So we have an actual cut on our baseline. But the 2% efficiencies have to be looked at in the context of having already had 9% efficiencies within the last 10 years. And having done that, we have pared back to the bone what we can do. Every year when we get our budget, we haven't enough money. There are gaps. But we make those up through in-year monitoring, so we're able to do that. We can't do that when it comes to things like, for example, employing staff, because you have to have certainty, and that's where the PSNI issue comes. It's not enough to say, well, you might get more money in the monitoring round, because they will have made a commitment, an employment commitment to people. So that's why they are halted now to see where they're likely to be. But there comes a point where the starting gap is too big for us to bridge, and that's the space that we're in now. So, for example, last year we didn't get everything we wanted, but we knew that we could potentially bridge the gap within year monitoring rounds and bring ourselves up to a point where we would be able to manage through in-year monitoring, we would be able to manage that gap. We're now in a situation where the gap is too big. And so effectively the only way we can find those efficiencies, and I mean, people can call them cuts or efficiencies, but ultimately, if we have to not spend 2% less than before, it effectively means a reduction in service that is commensurate with that reduction in funding. So I understand the point that's being made, and people are dancing on the head of a pin, I suppose, about is it a cut or is it not a cut? Is it a cut? Well, it is in the first year, yes. And it is a very tiny increase in second and third years. But if you compare it to other departments, as in fact the Fiscal Commission did, they have been very clear that justice is by far the worst affected in this, and that it is a real terms cut. Maybe Peter or Marianne maybe want to maybe expand on that a little bit just for clarity. But I mean, it isn't a figment of my imagination nor the departments, and you'll have heard from our colleagues who have come and briefed the committee. It is a concern across the board, not just in the department. And as I say, there is this fundamental issue that it isn't an equitable outcome when you compare it to other departments either, who are being asked to make 2% efficiencies but are having money added in afterwards. We're being asked to make 2% efficiencies with the money already added in. So when we take it out, it's actually more significant than it looks. So, for example, our security funding is being included, and we're saying, well, actually, if you look at that, that's not open to us. We can't spend that as a department or reallocate it or anything like that, and it's not part of our baseline. Maybe.
No, I think you've explained it well. I'm happy to pick up on any points of clarification, though, from the member.
No, just following on from that then, and this could be my ignorance, so I apologise. Just in the budget consequences document, you know, it shows that after Treasury, after the security funding and after ring fence funding, the department is facing a flat budget this year, but increase of 1% and 0.4% are planned in the following 2 years. Have I picked that up wrong?
It's minus 0.1% this year. It's 0.7% the following year and 0.1% the following year on that. So it goes down first, and that's when you take the security and the domestic and sexual abuse funding off, when you take that out and only look at our baseline.
Okay.
So it's page 7 of the budget consequences
Yeah.
document sets out the table, table 1.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's that last slide, the revised percentage change from baseline.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's fair enough. That's a wee bit clearer now. In my head. No, that's fair enough. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Jim. I suppose the difficulty for committees and for members and for ministers and officials is how much of our own narrative do we believe? Is it actually as it is? So setting all that aside, when you go, and Minister, rightly, because I've carried it around with me this last two weeks, the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council's report, and the most telling graph in that report, an independent report which cannot be challenged in terms of anybody the authors of that was in any way preferential to any either executive or executive ministers, clearly shows that there's one department that has clearly a very large increase over the period of time, which is an issue that I think others need to be questioning, and justice is a minus. So I think that plus the comment, I think the commentary that Sir Robert made was, this sounds even-handed in terms of asking departments for 2% efficiency. He referred to it as a cut, but if we even take it as a 2% efficiency to provide extra money for health, this sounds even-handed, but the proposed distribution of the increased block grant creates relative winners and losers among the departments, and there is little explanation of the choices made. And I suppose that summarises everything that you have said in relation to where the department finds itself.
Well, Chairman, I suppose the issue for me is that, and I mean, I'm not suggesting that setting a budget for the next 3 years is going to be easy, but we were all free to some degree to be a little bit more distant from our own department's demands, because we don't know that we'll be in these departments after the budget period. So it's sort of, we can look at it slightly more objectively, which I think has been helpful. But what strikes me is that instead of us looking at activity that the departments as a whole are engaging in and prioritising those, so if we're going to say domestic abuse is a priority, then funding for domestic abuse should be prioritised across all departments. If we're going to say violence against women and girls is a priority, then it should be prioritised across all departments. Instead, what we've done is salami slice all the budgets without any reference to whether some departments have more slack in their budget than others. And the result of that could be that at the same time, for example, DOJ might fail to meet its statutory duties. Another department could be doing things that are very worthy but unnecessary, because they will have the slack in their budget to allow that. Because there's been no internal prioritisation. It's been left to individual ministers to say, what would I prioritise in justice in order to live within my budget? What would I prioritise in education to live within my budget? But nobody has said, of the things in justice and education, which would we prioritise in order that the executive lives within its budget? So you end up with a situation where some things that are lower priority overall may be higher priority within some departments and get funded at the expense of things that overall are high priority, but there is no money in that department to fund it. And I think that it's a difficult one, I think, to get beyond. I think it requires, in part, that we would have had a programme for government that would have allowed the executive to set out very clearly what its main objectives are. But if you look at the objectives from the last programme for government, things like well-being, things like feeling safe and secure in your neighbourhood, a lot of those are delivered by justice. And I suppose the danger in all of this is because the big winner is health, as it should be in my view. I think health needs the investment. It also needs a lot of reform done, and perhaps it needs the additional investment in order that that can be delivered. But from my perspective, much of what we deliver contributes to good health and well-being, and that can't be overlooked, nor can the impact of cuts in the Department of Justice, and indeed in some other departments in terms of people's health and well-being. I mean, it's hard to have good health and well-being if you're homeless. It's hard to have good health and well-being if you're in the middle of a family breakdown and you can't get it resolved in the courts. So all of those things will impact on people's health and well-being, way beyond simply primary care and secondary care services. And I think it's about trying to look at it more holistically. And my frustration has been that we haven't had the opportunity to look and say, of all of the things different departments are doing, of all of the priorities that they're setting, where do they stack up against each other? I think, Peter, you may have actually been an executive when we did an original budget setting exercise at the time. We did this sort of exercise where we were all asked to score things we were doing or might do based on how necessary they were. And you know how worthy they were, I suppose, and how necessary. And everything came out about a 7. And people were saying, well, this shows that the executive's very united. I actually think it shows we're very bad at prioritising and being ruthless and saying, actually, this is very worthy, but as a priority, it's lower priority than this thing, which is essential. And I think we haven't really done that with this budget. And I think the consequence of that is that in justice, some extremely essential things are being put at risk, whilst in other departments there is the luxury of doing some very worthy things that I wouldn't object to, provided I was able to do the essentials.
And as opposed to, you could argue, in fairness to the Finance Minister, that he has tried to prioritise because he said this is about health.
Yes.
But as Sir Robert has said in the Fiscal Council's report, the devil then is in the detail.
Yes.
Because it has a unintended consequence
Of course.
for other departments. And then everybody, like, you only have to get into that chamber. Everything is a priority.
Well,
You know,
exactly.
everything has to get the money, and it doesn't matter where you get the money from, it has to be a priority. And that's
that-
a real, that's not living in the real world.
No, that's a challenge. And the other aspect of this is, of course, that I agree health should be the priority. I don't think anyone at the executive table or indeed in the Assembly will argue about that. The question is whether everything that is health related is delivered by the Department of Health.
Yes,
So, for example,
absolutely.
I made the point, not to the benefit of the Department of Justice, I've already set out where we make a contribution, but for example, the money invested in cycle paths and walkways and green travel and active travel, that is absolutely crucial to people's mental health and well-being. It's crucial to fitness, it's crucial to people's kind of mental health. If you strip that away, you're just going to end up with sicker people needing the health service. So there are lots of things that don't immediately say health on them in terms of the department, But in terms of making a contribution to health and wellbeing in our community, they're important. Strong community groups, strong community association, investing in sport and arts, those things are often dismissed, and you will know this from your time as a minister in that space. But the idea that those sorts of things that matter, that they matter less, actually have a huge impact on people's mental health, on people's sense of safety and security, on their well-being. So it's about trying to ensure, I suppose, that we don't prioritise departments, but that we prioritise outcomes. So that's where the programme for government, I think, would have helped to guide this, where we would have been saying, what is the outcome? What do we want society to see the benefit? What is it we're aiming for? And then which departments are contributing to those outcomes, and how do we fund it so they can continue to do that?
And I think, and with this, and I'm going to bring in Rachel, but I think that one of the issues is we've now put the cart before the horse, because we're setting the budget, so we're setting the amount of money that we're going to have for 3 years. And if there's an assembly after the election, then we're going to have a programme for government that has to, doesn't matter what people may say, it'll have to be aligned with the amount of money that is available to deliver. So, and we're starting out from the starting block saying that the priority is health, but it'll not be reflected then in terms of other departments. And the one that I think is for justice, and as a former member of the policing board, we worked hard to see it delivered, is the Musgrave Street custody suite. That saves at least 40% of people who are going to A&E, and yet there's a whole issue now about who funds it, and it'll probably stymie rolling that out to the new provision in Antrim and to other custody suites, and the losers will be the individuals themselves, and secondly the entire health and justice family, because we're not doing the thing the best way that we could because the money hasn't been allocated.
And I mean, I saw recently myself, I was up in the Northwest, and I met with people up there who were doing some really good work around people who were landing in A&E with the police because either they had been endangering themselves or somebody else. Yeah. They were taken into A&E. They were sitting there for hours. The police were sitting with them. If the police left, they would then go missing, and there was nobody to engage them in terms of triaging them and everything else. And you could end up in that. I mean, we had a really interesting conversation. At that particular period when we were in Derry, they were saying that 8 out of 10 calls to the police at that time were people in distress, not crime, not reporting crime, not dealing with crime, but people in distress. And you could end up with whole neighbourhood teams being tied up in Galvin A&E, just waiting for somebody to be seen because they had a mental health issue or whatever it might be. And one of the things that had been done there was really creative work with the Department for Education and the Education Authority about putting youth workers into A&E to actually get alongside the young people who were being brought in. They kind of transitioned them across from the police. The police could get on with their business. They would stay with the youth worker and engage with the youth worker, and they were much more likely then to stay. Plus the youth worker could catch up with them the next week and check everything was fine. That was a major cost saving, but it required investment in the system to start with to get it running. So it's that sort of stuff that I wouldn't want to see lost. But it is a direct implication in terms of justice budgets and health budgets. And the better we deal with people who are in distress, things like the multi-agency triage team, you rightly mentioned the custody suite in Musgrave and so on. If we can get as early as possible the required therapeutic and medical interventions to people, they're much less likely to go on to have to be taken to primary care, to hospital and other places. And it's less resource intensive in the long run, but it does require an upfront investment to do that. And often these things can be de-escalated on the street. They can be de-escalated at the custody suite and actually never need to go to a hospital. But the difficulty comes if the resource isn't there, when in those cases the police have no alternative but to take people to hospital. And I mean, we saw recently in the evidence that was given the number of times that the police are doing that simply as an alternative to the other provisions that are there.
Rachel?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister. And Peter, apologies, I'm keeping my camera off because I'm in my Stormont office, and as we all know, the internet is pretty bad. Thank you for your answers so far. I'm not going to go through all of the things that have been touched upon, you'd be glad to know, but I note that as we're speaking, the Finance Minister is in the chamber making a statement with regard to the budget. And I just want to ask Minister overall, what's the impact of there being no executive now on this budget for the next financial year? If it has been reported the increase in health cannot go ahead. The Finance Minister has confirmed that without the executive, no 3-year budget can go ahead. And I suppose, what does this mean for justice? There was a discussion of 300 million to be allocated for the next financial year, and was justice to be allocated if any of that? If maybe the department or yourself, Minister, have any assurances from Conor Murphy with regard to this pot, and what does that mean sort of with the future where we are now?
Well, from not having an executive, I mean, we can't really proceed, Rachel, with a budget. It's not possible. It requires there to be an executive vote to agree the budget. The budget isn't even in a situation where the draft budget was reflective of an agreed position by executive. It was simply agreed that we could go to consultation on that basis. But I had noted that I wasn't agreeable to the budget. I think there were other ministers who had done likewise. So it wasn't reflective of, if you like, a settled position in executive. And certainly with respect to the additional funding at the centre that could be reallocated, it will not be able, my understanding is, to be reallocated into next year's budget until there is an executive to agree that, because I think whatever way you cut this, it would be seen as significant cross-cutting and controversial. I don't think anything, I think money is the one thing that we can always say is significant cross-cutting and controversial, so it's something that would have to go through the executive. So it does leave us in a difficult position. We are aware of the additional funding that is available at the centre, and my officials have been engaging with the Department of Finance officials just to try to find out whether there is any prospect of that money being allocated, or some of that money being allocated to justice, that would allow us, I suppose, to put ourselves in a position that we have previously been in. So we're realistic. We're not going to get everything we want in justice. It would be lovely if that happened, but it's unlikely given the constraints within which the Finance Minister has to work. But we would hopefully be able to put ourselves in a situation where at least we were within distance of being able to deal with issues through monitoring rounds. That would be, I suppose, the kind of ideal situation we would find ourselves in, where there would be some prospect of closing that gap. But there will not be able to be any budget set until we have an executive able to meet, discuss and vote on it, and then it would be brought to the Assembly obviously after that. There's also the complication that it's out for consultation at the moment, so even had the executive agreed the budget for consultation, it wouldn't have been possible to take account of the consultation responses without there being an executive. So we are stuck in a very difficult situation. My understanding is that the baseline on which future spend will be carried forward, so you'll recall potentially from the last hiatus here that it was around 65% of expenditure could be made, would be based on previous year's expenditure. Now, we're not sure with any certainty how that will be, the kind of previous allocation. We're not sure with certainty what that will look like, and that's something I think being worked through at the moment. I think it's 65% for a certain length of time, and then it rises to 95% if that extends. But I'm going to hand over to Peter, because he's the man who had to manage this during the last suspension. So I'll hand over to Peter and he can keep me right, but I think it's around 65% of spend would be allocated at the start. So it isn't that the department won't be able to spend anything, but it won't have any certainty in terms of what the 3-year budget would look like. And it would be a treading water position, I guess is the best way to describe it.
Yeah, I think, Minister, you've explained it well. The difficulty is in doing any planning. The objective had been to set a 3-year budget, because we all accept that a 3-year budget provides for better long-term planning. If we haven't even got certainty about what year 1 looks like, then that creates real challenges. So to make that real, if we were to, I think we would be unwise to work from the draft budget because it's not agreed. But if that was the basis we worked on, we would then need to start making wholesale cuts now in order to be able to live within our budget next year. And that would mean real serious damage being done to a whole set of core public services in the justice field. If we don't make those steps, and beyond deferring some recruitment, we aren't making those steps immediately, then of course we run the risk that if the draft budget does end up being the budget, we end up with a budget we can't manage, and as accounting officer, that could create put me in a very difficult place in terms of overspends and so on. But I think we need to allow the budget process to work through, not least because there is some money at the centre that hasn't yet been allocated, and it wouldn't be proportionate, in my view, to slam the brakes on and do that damage to public services while that process is still ongoing.
Okay. Rachel? Hello? Rachel, you okay?
I think it's maybe a casualty of the bad Wi-Fi in here.
Terrible. They spend money.
Right, Chair, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Rachel. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I'm just moving halfway across the room to try and get some reception.
Terrible. Okay. Is that it? Have you another question, Rachel?
I do. I've plenty. Thank you for that. It's certainly a very difficult position. I suppose a treading water position, if not almost sinking, though, in terms of this situation. And just for Peter, if the draft budget was worked on, could that lead to potential legal challenge?
I don't think there's any basis to work on the draft budget because it wasn't agreed by the executive, and in any case it's not been through the proper consultation exercise, so I don't think you could work from the draft budget. The point I was making was that if an incoming executive or a future executive decision went back to the draft budget position, that could create a real problem.
Thank you. Just in terms of budget pooling, this has come up a number of times, and I know certainly the Minister will be aware of the Children's Services Cooperation Act, and it does just in trying to tease out information on budget pooling rather than sort of resource only. It seems that this is not being kind of utilised financially. So I'm just wondering if you'd be able to comment on how that particular act is operated within the department in conjunction, say, with other departments such as health, or is this something that doesn't actually happen in budgets?
Well, we do have some pooled resource, for example, the domestic abuse and sexual offences. So the domestic and sexual abuse stuff is kind of resourced on across departmental basis. The paramilitary tackling paramilitarism programme again is resourced across departments from a common budget line. So there is some pooling of resource, but I would say it's probably at the margins. The difficulty is that in this case, what you would be asking is for departments in the main who are having to reduce their budgets to then give up resources, to share resources with other departments, and I think that's going to be quite challenging. There has been some good cooperation. I mean, for example, the mental health champion is funded by all departments, so each department makes a financial contribution to that post, and there are other good examples of where we have worked on a cross-departmental basis, including financially. But I think we need to be realistic that the issue here isn't about pooling resources, it's about there not being sufficient resources to start with. And the fact that health is getting the lion's share, if you like, of any money that's coming through is indicative of the fact that to date they are arguing that they haven't had enough to be able to do the reform that's required. So they're unlikely to have surplus, if you like, to share with others at the end of that process, or it would rather undermine the argument that they needed the additional money up front to start with. But yes, I mean, there is cooperation, but it isn't kind of core, and it wouldn't allow us to do the essential things that are departmental statutory functions. Those fall to us and only us to deliver.
Rachel's gone off. No, she's still here. Do you hear us, Rachel?
It's turning into more a seance in the committee meeting.
No, she's gone offline now. All right, Stephen.
She's still showing up, but she's back.
Rachel, can you hear us? Okay. Right, I think we'll sadly have to bring that to an end. Minister, can I just thank you and your officials, to Peter and to Mary Ann, for coming. It really is appreciated the time you've given. And if there's any other queries or questions, obviously with the committee on Thursday, no doubt there may be some coming to that, and then we'll be in correspondence with you. But in the meantime, thank you very much.
I'm more than happy at any time, Chair. And if there's anything further officials can do to assist in terms of going through figures and so on, again, we're at your disposal.
And we're now looking to be in the chamber at 2 o'clock. It looks as though they have moved. Question time is not now happening.
Oh,
So they have put an indicative timing out again, I noticed. So we could be on 2 o'clock.
looking forward to it.
Can't wait. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Members, just to bring this to a close, just if there was any other issues that we wanted to have included in the committee's response, because we have to have it agreed and signed off by Thursday, is that right? I think we've covered all the issues that need to be, need to be raised. There's nothing else. Kristen, there's nothing else on the back of that, I don't think. I think.
We'll prepare a draft response. I'm just not sure whether, given the statement this morning,
Yes.
the draft response will be prepared for the Committee for Finance at its request, so whether
Okay,
that
look
will
at that
change.
then. Okay.
But we'll keep an
Okay.
eye on it and do whatever.
Thank you. Members, the next meeting will be Thursday at 2 p.m. in this room. So thank you very much, and we'll see you at 2 o'clock in the chamber for the Justice Bill. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thereabouts, Tim, wait a minute.
To be honest, that helped.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 30. This is the